So at the end of the last video, we were talking about rehearsal, this idea that if you repeat information over and over and over and keep it in your short-term memory for longer than you would normally have that information, that increases the chances of the information moving into your long-term memory. So I want you to use this technique of rehearsal now in this experiment for repeating things over and over and over again. We're going to do something called the serial position effect experiment. And I'm going to read to you and show you 20 objects. And then after I've shown you the 20 objects, I'll ask you to pick up a pen and write down all the objects that you can remember. Okay, but remember to use rehearsal as a technique for trying to remember. Okay, so get your pen ready. Some paper. Do not use it yet. Don't cheat. I'll tell you when. The objects are coming now. Telephone. Dog. Television. A car. A cuddly toy. Glasses. Aftershave. A top hat. A teapot. Candlesticks. Suitcases. A bike. A key. Toast. A tent. Beans. A plant. A roller skate. Football. A dinosaur. Don't do anything yet, just rehearse. Okay, pick up your pen and write down as many as you can remember. Okay, so how did you get on? Let's go through them again and just mark off the ones that you got. Telephone, dog, television, car, cuddly toy, glasses, aftershave, top hat, teapot, candlesticks, suitcases, bike, key, toast, tent, beans, plant, roller skate, football, dinosaur, and that's us. How did you get on? Well, interestingly, the objects at the start, and you'll probably do this as a class this week in a live lesson, but the objects, most people remember the objects at the start and the objects at the end. And that's what's called the serial position effect. This idea that if you give people 20 objects to remember, the ones in the middle are the ones that are forgotten most often. So that's saying really that the first few objects, so the telephone, the dog, and the television, and the car, are likely to be remembered. Why is that? Well, it's because you're rehearsing the first ones, aren't you? As soon as you get the first one, what do? You say, telephone, 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 telephone. Telephone, dog, telephone, dog. Telephone, dog, television. Telephone, dog, television. Telephone, dog, television, car. Telephone, dog, television, car. You're rehearsing it. You're keeping it in your short-term memory over and over and over and over again. So that increases the chances of that information moving into your long-term memory, that rehearsal. And that's what's called the primacy effect. Okay, so the primacy effect is this idea that because of rehearsal, you move the information into your long-term memory. And then when you need to pull it back, you're able to do that. The recency effect describes the fact that most people remember the things that were mentioned last. And that makes sense because this information here is still held within the short-term memory. And so it's relatively easy to remember the things at the end. But the ones in the middle, because by the time you get to about 6 or 7 objects, you can't remember all of those for your rehearsal. And so you tend to forget to rehearse these ones in the middle. And so it doesn't move into your long-term memory. And also the limit of the short-term memory means because it's a 7 limit in terms of its capacity, it usually means the ones in the middle here are not held in the short-term memory either. So that's the primacy and the recency effect, and that overall graph that illustrates it, that's called the serial position effect. The short-term memory can store data. We said it can store short bits of memory, 7 pieces of information, 30 seconds. It can also process data. You can use information in the short-term memory to work things out. So as an example, think of all the pieces of furniture in your house that have got drawers, and then work out, without using a pen or a pencil, work out how many drawers there are. So pause the video and have a go. So what did you do? How did you work that out? Well, if you're anything like me, I'm walking around my house in my head. So I'm going into my bedroom, and on the left, I can visually see a set of drawers, and there are 6 drawers there. And if I move it into my son's room, in the far corner, there are 8 drawers there. 6 plus 8 is 14. And if I come into the study, I know there are 6 drawers there. So 14 plus the 6 is 20. And so it goes on. But can you see how you are working it out? You're taking a little bit of information and you're holding that information. So I'm holding the fact that there were 6 drawers in my bedroom, and then I combine that with the fact that there are 8 drawers in his room, my son's room. And at the same point, I calculate that comes to 14. So I'm not using my long-term memory here. I'm not sad enough that I've remembered long-term how many drawers I've got in my house. But I'm able to work it out by holding information within my short-term memory and using that information. And that's called the working memory. So it's good to know basics. So for example, in maths, it's good to know your times tables because it frees up your working memory. So what I mean by that is if you have to think, if you have to work out what 5 times 5 is, if it takes quite a bit of working out, then that uses up capacity of your working memory because there's a limit to what your working memory can actually achieve. But if you just know 5 5s are 25, you don't have to give it any thought. Your working memory isn't being used up at all. You just know the answer automatically. And so that gives you more capacity to use your working memory. So knowing your times tables in maths is very, very important because it helps you to solve more difficult problems. The same is true in biology. If you know the basics, if you know where proteins are made, you just know ribosomes. Yeah, if you know where DNA is held, nucleus, you just know these basics off by heart, then it frees up your working memory to be able to carry out more difficult, more complex questions, such as the problem-solving questions that you get. We're going to have a look at long-term memory as well. So long-term memory has an unlimited capacity in terms of how much it can store. So the short-term memory, we said, it's about 7 pieces of information. So as soon as you put an 8th piece of information into your short-term memory, in effect, it in effect pushes out information from your short-term memory. That information either has to go into your long-term memory or it gets lost. That's not the case in the long-term memory. There's an unlimited capacity to how much it can store. So you don't have things falling out of your brain when you put new stuff in. It also holds information for an extremely long time. So it's not the 30-second limit that the short-term memory has. To move things into your long-term memory, though, you need to encode them. You need to transfer them and encode them in a way that the long-term memory can store it. So there are 3 main types of encoding. We've discussed some of them already. So we've mentioned rehearsal, this idea of just repeating information again and again and again, keeping it in your short-term memory. And if you hold it in your short-term memory for a long period of time, it increases the chances of that information being encoded and moved into the long-term memory. Another thing that you can do to encode information is to organize the information to give it some structure. And that links in a little bit with elaboration as well. So when you give something some structure, it tends to make a little bit more sense. and you can see perhaps how it fits in with other things that you've learned previously. And that's what elaboration really is. Elaboration is really understanding something inside out. So you can remember something. So for example, if I was to talk to you about protein synthesis, you could have rehearsed an answer to what is the definition of protein synthesis. And you could give me an answer. You could say, oh, well, protein synthesis is the making of a protein, and it happens at the ribosome. Yeah, that's correct. That's true. But it doesn't mean that you understand anything about what you've just said. You can repeat it, but do you understand it? Could you visualize that process? Could you explain that process inside out? Could you write a detailed essay? Could you explain to somebody else that process and answer their questions on it even? If you can do that, if you understand it to that level, then that's elaboration. That's you seeing all angles of it, seeing how it links in with other things within the subject, and you have a complete understanding. Now, if you use elaboration and organization, then that leads to something called deeper encoding, and you're more likely to remember. So if we think of this as an example, you could have a shopping list. You're asked to go to the shop to get some ingredients for a meal. And you could rehearse it. You could just say bread, parsley, milk, pasta, bread, parsley, milk, pasta, bread, parsley, milk, pasta, carrots, bread, parsley, milk, pasta, carrots. And you could do that over and over again. And that would be semi-useful. You'd probably remember more of the items than if you didn't rehearse. And a way of organizing it might be by chunking that information into meaningful groups. So the milk, the cream, and the butter could be chunked as to one piece of information as 3 dairy. And then you can chunk the vegetables together or the produce together, and you chunk the starches together. So you actually, by organizing the information, you almost have less information to remember. It makes it a lot easier to remember than just remembering the list of ingredients. And then you can elaborate on that. Elaboration might be by visualizing yourself making the recipe. So if you can imagine taking those ingredients and using those ingredients and how you would use the ingredients to make the meal, that's really elaborating and understanding that process. And that would actually help you to remember what you need from the shop. So there's 2 types of encoding, the shallow and deep encoding. So rehearsal, repetition, leads to shallow encoding. So you remember things, you do remember them, but there's perhaps a lack of understanding of what it is that you're remembering. Deeper encoding means that you understand what it is that you're remembering. And that is the best form of encoding. You are more likely to retain the information and to be able to retrieve the information when you need it if you encode deeply. So that has important implications for your revision and for your learning. So if you use flashcards, Brainscape, well, that's a form of rehearsal. It doesn't necessarily mean that you understand any of what you're learning or what you're remembering, but that doesn't make it unimportant. It doesn't make it not useful, but it's just the starting point of your revision. It shouldn't be the sole thing you do for your revision. You need to organize information. So you can organize information by doing mind maps, showing how different topics and different subtopics link together. Look at the connections between protein synthesis and DNA and enzymes. You should, in your head, be able to see the links between those topics. Elaboration links in a little bit with organization, but really understanding what it is that you're learning, that will give you the deeper encoding and better memory. So essays, detailed essays, helping somebody out, explaining it, teaching it to somebody else, asking questions. How do you elaborate on something? How do you fully understand something? Well, you ask as many questions as you can until it makes sense to you, and that will help you to remember it. So keep that in mind, please. Rehearsal, Brainscape, flashcards, great, fantastic, but just the starting point. So again, just to reinforce it, flashcards is the starting point. Learn the basics. Remember we said the basics are important. It's like learning your times tables. It helps your working memory. It frees up capacity in your working memory to do the more challenging things, because the simple things just come to mind without you really having to think about it. But make sure you elaborate and organize. So your revision should include essays, mind maps, revision posters, teaching somebody else, asking lots and lots of questions. And then once you've got an understanding of the subjects, then that's the time that you need to start looking at your past paper questions and trying to put it into practice. So the long-term memory stores information, but you need to be able to pull that information from the long-term memory in order to use it. You need to be able to retrieve that information. And so basically, when you're searching for information, when you're looking for a memory or an answer to a question, your brain basically carries out a search throughout your long-term memory to try to find that particular piece of information. And a contextual cue is a cue, or it's a signal, or it's something that helps to trigger that particular memory. And usually, or it can include things that were present. It can be the conditions or the circumstances that were present at the time that the information was encoded into your long-term memory. So as an example, my memories, if we go back to the example of me being at football, all those memories that are associated with me standing at Spotland watching Rochdale, they can be triggered by a Northern Soul record that I hear on the radio sometimes. So that was a song that was played all the time just before the football. And whenever I hear that record, it reminds me of being there at the football and everything that goes along with that, the cigarettes and the swearing and the flat caps. There'll be things similar with yourself. You'll have maybe a record that reminds you of a particular time or a particular person. There might be smells, a particular smell from the kitchen that reminds you of a certain time in your family. These things are the cues that can trigger the memory. And the more contextual cues you have, the easier it is to search and to basically pull out that information. So if you've ever had tip of tongue state, sometimes that's caused by a lack of contextual cues, a lack of triggers, really, in order to be able to find that information. When you know the answer, but you just can't rack your brains to find that information. And that's basically what's going on. The information's in there somewhere, but you just can't find it. It's not been stored, perhaps in an organized way, so that you're able to find it. So this has implications for your learning as well, and how you learn. So if we're moving information into our long-term memory when we're carrying out studying, then the way that we study, the conditions in which we study and the circumstances needs to be similar to the conditions that we're going to experience when we start doing an exam. So if you're lying on your bed listening to music while studying, that's not really going to help you in terms of contextual cues when you sat in an exam room or in a classroom that's silent. So you'd be better when you're studying sat at a desk in a quiet room in order to study. So a quick summary. We mentioned the short-term memory. We mentioned the sensory memory, the fact that, first of all, that filters out the majority of information because we don't need it, and we just pay attention to some things. The things that we pay attention to go into our short-term memory. There's a limit to the short-term memory, 7 items or 30 seconds. We can encode information from the short-term memory to the long-term memory through rehearsal, organization, and elaboration. Remember that there's shallow encoding from rehearsal, but if you want deeper encoding, then you really need to elaborate, you really need to understand, you need to ask questions. And again, to pull that information out from our long-term memory, which can hold information for a long period of time, we need these contextual cues. We need triggers that will help us to find that information. So have a look at the key learning points. There was an awful lot, 2 videos worth. Potentially there should have been 3. But have a look and think, remember what we said about elaboration. You need to not just remember this or shallow encode it, but make sure you understand it. So have a look at this and think what your questions are.